welcome to today's broadcast of North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of NIC television students, and your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
It is the second of a 4-week series that we are bringing you on the topic, the state of prejudice in America today. I want to recognize the organization that's made this opportunity available to us, the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment Incorporated, that has just recently held a 3-day convention in our city and is a new organization with great promise in civil and human rights in the Pacific Northwest. Our guest on the second program is a very distinguished person who has been active for many, many years in the civil rights movement in the United States. We welcome to the program Reverend Hosea Williams, who served for 10 years in the Georgia legislature. It is our understanding now that his wife has that seat that he used to hold in the legislature. He is presently an Atlanta City Council person. He is also the pastor of the Martin Luther King People's Church of Love in Atlanta. He also heads the Atlanta Metro chapter of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Our guest was an associate with the late Dr. Martin Luther King and has, I've indicated, many, many years in civil rights work. It's my understanding that our guest has been arrested for his civil rights work 108 times. Which
124 times.
124 since I saw your resume. It's been added. Reverend Williams, it's a pleasure to have you here, and we look so much to doing this interview and hearing your very valuable words.
Thank you.
And I'm so happy to welcome the program to assist in questioning today Idaho State Representative Jeannie Givens. She serves the 5 most northern counties of Idaho in the legislature, and she's in her second term. And I shall ask Representative Givens to commence the questioning.
Thank you, Tony. It's a pleasure to be here again. Reverend Williams, what do you think is the biggest threat to the civil rights movement today?
Well, I would have to say that things really hadn't changed that much. The basic root cause of racism, of religious prejudice, is poverty, economic exploitation, and there have been some cosmetics changes, but there is a wider gap in America today between the haves and the have-nots. And I think the greatest danger is for the leadership of oppressed people to become pacified. That really worries me. I think the greatest mistake that we made in this country is to seemingly believe that Martin Luther King Jr.'s strategies became obsolete with his death. And that's one thing about the convention that's so inspiring. I guess the greatest moment I spent with Dr. King is when he said that to us blacks, that the problem we struggle to solve, we'll never solve it, because it's not a black problem, it's an American problem. And I remember him saying these words: now we must go to the West and organize the Spanish-speaking Americans, and we must go to, he said, the North and organize Puerto Ricans, and we must go to the Carolinas and organize the Indians, and we must go to the Appalachian, organize the poor whites, and we must take the poor of the nation and confront the power structure. So that's why this convention is so inspiring. But I think from my perspective, the greatest threat is, I said that the major difference today is that the oppressors, particularly the black community, the only thing that's changed is the color of their skin. We told blacks, Dr. King said, the sweetest walk you'll ever take is to the ballot box. And I can remember one march that I organized. I was the chief organizer from Selby to Montgomery, and 5 people died on that one march. 3 of them was white. And we got the right to vote. And we, in a, I guess, roundabout way, was saying, now if you really want to upgrade your quality of life, you vote, particularly in the Deep South, old whitey out, and vote black in. And just too many cases where we voted black in, the same power structure is manipulating blackies just like they manipulated whiteies. So I think the greatest danger is for the leadership to sell out.
Leadership to become passive.
Become passive.
Okay, thank you.
Reverend Williams, I'd like to ask a question I asked last week on the program. In the 1960s, when Dr. King really, I think, touched the conscience of America and all of you helping him, and we had such important movements in this country, and of course that was the decade that we got the really significant legislation in 64 and 65. And there seemed to be an awakening of an awareness that there were great problems in civil rights, and they were at least addressing a portion of those. It seems that coming with the 1970s and then the 1980s, the whole issue of civil rights and human rights went back on the back burner. It wasn't discussed as much in the media, and there wasn't as much attention by government officials. Do you agree with that conclusion? And if so, why did that happen?
Well, what I call the rich elite, the power structure, is the greatest in the world on the old cliche of divide and conquer. And I think one of the things that's happened in the past 10 years is pit the Indians against Spanish-speaking America, against blacks, against Jews, even against women. And there's been such a division among the minorities in the country. And minorities must realize that old saying, none of us will be free until all of us are free. That certainly has been a retrogression of progress in the human rights movement. I do think, as I often define Ronald Reagan, as the Rutherford B. Hayes of this period. Violence has reoccurred throughout this nation. And you see, I take the position that racism is all but a facade. And that's why they killed Dr. King. He finally stopped saying, integrate this and integrate that. He started demanding economic justice. And I think that's when because no racist redneck from Alabama killed Martin Luther King Jr. It was the decision makers and those that really control this country. So we reached a point of employment, a point of kids being able to go to college to a greater degree than ever before. And when Ronald Reagan came in, a retrogression took place. And they once again began to pit sick groups like the Nazi Party, the Ku Klux Klan, and these white fascist groups against minorities. So I think the root cause of racism is economics. Racism itself is a symptom of a deeper frustration. And it's appalling to me because once, I never did agree. I was one, and that's why they called me an old battle-fatigued general. I never did agree that we ought to come out of the streets because the greatest weapon that the minorities have ever had is non-violent direct action. That's the greatest weapon. I think that's proved true for the Indians. It is proved true for blacks, Mexican Americans, Jews, what have you. And I just think when Dr. King died and people began saying it's time to move the movement from the streets into the suite, the office building suite, the hotel suite, it's time to stop demonstrating and start negotiating. Power is never relinquished, only upon demand. And the only thing we had demand with was our bodies, nonviolence. But you take Forsyth County there, I just can't believe in 1986, no one is more against the apartheid government of South Africa than I am, but charity begins at home. And it worried me by seeing a lot of leaders from the Atlanta area going to Washington, attacking the apartheid government in South Africa, and right in our backyard, Forsyth, Georgia, was just as bad, which we proved when we went there on Dr. King's birthday. And the groups that you have all across this country, the violence, it used to be almost, we thought it was almost confined to the Southland or confined to blacks. But now the North is as violent, if not more violent, than the South. violence being perpetrated upon Indians nowadays, I guess, have always surpassed that of blacks, but they admit that now. The violence to the Spanish-speaking people in this country. So that violence across this country, I can't believe you take like the Citadel, the way blacks are being treated now and driven out of military schools. An example, the Citadel in South Carolina. Howard Beach was just the old Southern lynching. The governor of Arizona with the gall just to walk in and cancel Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. But I do believe why I don't have a real negative attitude toward the future, because like this coalition, I think this is one of the greatest things could happen in America. And believe it or not, we came out of the Forsyth County movement with a coalition. We had not worked together in a coalition since the death of Dr. King until 1987. And now we have a coalition, and I do believe we are. Dr. King used to tell us that the movement, the struggle for human dignity in America would not always be on an uphill climb. We would come into periods that would be a descending. But when we start up again, just try to go higher next time than we were last time until we reach that mountaintop.
That's the purpose behind the coalition. We're now incorporating in our board of directors under the bylaws indicate just what you're talking about. It is not one particular ethnic group, but it is a combination of the various ethnic groups that exist in the Northwest.
I said this is the same coalition we went to Washington with. We went with the Poor People's Campaign. A very similar coalition. I think you may be quite a bit more sophisticated, particularly relating to the legislative body, but the hearts of the people in this country are not changed with legislative laws. That's an aid. But I just hope this coalition will spread throughout this country. Blacks cannot make it alone. No place in this country. Indians cannot make it alone. Not even the Spanish-speaking, the Jews, the Koreans, the Japanese cannot make it alone. It must be a combination, a uniting, a coalition of minority groups fighting to make the American dream become a living reality. I have problems in Atlanta. I had a situation a few weeks ago when they wanted to run a Korean out of business, and they came to me to lead it. And I said, yeah, we'll run him out. Let's go run him out. And I called the people together. I said, why you want to run this man out of business? I said, did he run a black out of, when he put his store in there? No, sir. Does he go out and make blacks come in his store and trade? But what's the problem? You can't fight for freedom for yourself if you don't extend that freedom to every American, irregardless of their race, creed, or color.
Thank you. Jeannie Gibbons.
Thank you, Tony. Reverend Williams, you talked about some of the biggest problems that with the civil rights movement in this country, that things are the same, that poverty still is one of the biggest issues, and there's so little economic power with people who need their civil rights protected. What do you think about getting involved within the two-party system? Do you advocate that blacks get involved in the Republican and Democratic parties?
Well, that is better than what we have now, but that's still the lesser evil. I endorsed Ronald Reagan in 1980, and God knows I didn't see anything in Ronald Reagan, but I didn't see that much in Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter helped those blacks that surrounded him, you know, but what did he do for the masses of the American people? Virtually nothing. When I endorsed Ronald Reagan, because I began to tell blacks, because black people black people in this country generally are political hostages for the white liberal wing of the Democratic Party. And that's the only way they'll vote, Democrats. So when the Democrats get in, they basically say, you don't have to do nothing for the blacks. Why? Because they're going to vote Democratic anyway. So when the Republicans get in, they say, we're not going to do nothing for the blacks. Why? Because they're not going to vote Republican. And that's one thing I thought I could persuade Ronald Reagan to do, as President Theodore Roosevelt did in 1932, because all basically blacks was in the Republican Party. And Roosevelt opened up jobs, and then blacks migrated. So I said, Mr. Reagan, if you put America back to work, that's the greatest thing that history could write about you. And I endorsed Reagan, called myself going to bring blacks into a two-party status. Now, I admit, the Mexican, American, Spanish-speaking people, they're doing a very fair job of it. The Jews, but blacks. So what blacks, I'd really like to see all of us do, because I don't believe in no parties, to be honest. I run under the Democratic ticket because that's the easiest way to get elected. But I do not believe in partisan. I think we ought to have that huge registered vote and let the Democrats bid for it and let the Republicans bid for it. And whichever one we believe will bring the most justice to America, I think that's the way we ought to vote.
So you do feel that maybe blacks have been overlooked by both parties?
No question about it. A typical example was the last national convention of the Democratic Party in San Francisco, California. To be honest about it, and it's a long story, they made concession to Jews, the Democratic Party. They made concession to Spanish-speaking Americans. They made concession to women. The only thing black got, Jesse Jackson got a chance to speak an hour on national television. That is the truth. Because they know blacks were not going to vote any other way.
One more question,
Sure.
Tony. Reverend Williams, what is the most significant thing that the Republican administration has done, the Reagan administration, for blacks?
I would have to be a little biased to answer that question because I think, and not for the man, but for the principle in which he taught and lived for and died for, I think the passage of Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, and I don't mean to use it for people just to raise some money. I said each year we should almost have like a new start to wipe out hunger, poverty, injustice in this country. I think that was one of the major accomplishments of Ronald Reagan. But I'd have to be frank in this instance. Reagan at one point, because it's what you think make what is. And he really gave confidence to the nation. Businesses got better. The economy flourished much more. But on the other hand, because the bad guy, and I've said this without fear, knowing that he may get me, there was Meese and Baker. Baker was the better guy. Meese and McDevitt. Mr. Reagan is not a bad guy. He is just so naive. You see, when he come to talk about black people, he never knew any black people except Sammy Davis Jr. and Eartha Kitt, you know? And so when it comes to the masses, so he would listen to McDevitt. But I think the thing that Mr. Reagan did as far as, at one point, instilling greater confidence in the American people, in their government, in their system, probably was the greatest thing. But I'm just so proud to go to my grave saying I was the guy that asked Ronald Reagan to pass the Martin Luther King Jr. birthday bill. And he said to me, he said, I don't believe you asked me that. And I said, why, Mr. You don't believe I asked you? He said that Jimmy Carter was like a member of the King family, and he didn't pass that bill. I said, well, Mr. Reagan, you needs it more for the sake of history, you know, because the way blacks conceive. And I think it's the greatest thing, honest to God, in my estimation, because, and I said, not for the man, but to foster the principles in which Martin Luther King Jr. lived and died.
That's quite an accomplishment for you and for the Republican Party.
Thank you, because the Republican Party did push it also.
I want to go back to Forsyth County. That's received obviously a lot of national attention. And can you bring us up to date at the time that that you brought to the attention of the people and you marched there? We heard a lot. Now we don't hear anything in the media. What is the status of? Have there been any changes after?
I'm a man. I try to always be honest. I'm not a good politician. The reason I went in, Forsyth has been there for 75 years. And the old saying around Atlanta, don't be caught in Forsyth, don't give out a gas in Forsyth County, or be caught there after dark. Many blacks, every 2 or 3 months, blacks are found dead or someplace around there. And 2 white guys were trying to hold a march, and one of them was martial arts teacher. They frightened him to death, and one of his students was running a martial arts school. They began to fight him to death. And I was on television. I said to myself, every movement we've ever been in, at least some whites came to our defense. Now here, these guys are troubled, and we blacks are playing deaf and dumb and blind. So I called a guy and said I would come and help lead the march and organize the march. He said, Mr. William, I don't think you'll leave here alive. I said, well, then that's I have to let the will of God deal with that. I called a press conference, and every black leader knew I was going to Forsyth. And I went up there with 50, what you'd call small people. And I'll be honest with you, being Martin Luther King Jr.'s field general, we went up against Bull Connor in Birmingham, Jim Clark in Selma, Alabama, Horace Manusa in St. Augustine, Florida, Ku Klux Klan in Philadelphia, Mississippi. And when we marched in Forsyth, I couldn't believe it. In 1987, I couldn't. And the press kept coming to me, and they was throwing rocks and bricks and raging. And the difference in the Forsyth mob, I've faced mobs before, but they generally was older white males. But I couldn't believe the number of 17 and 18-year-old kids, and the women who had babies in their arms, the large number of women. And finally the press came and said, "Is it bad?" I said, "No, it's not that bad. You seen it this bad before?" I said, "Oh, yes." And ducking all the same time, I had my grandson and two of my other kids with me, and the 50 person. And finally a fellow walked up to me, marched with us from Selma, Montgomery, and said, "Reverend, we ain't never seen it this bad." And I began to have to admit the truth. In 1986, we went on, we left Forsyth and went back to Atlanta. And I know we had to go back. I couldn't live with myself if we do not go back. If King could die, it's like Uzo and Reverend Reed and all those people for the struggle. Now, you're afraid to go back to Forsyth, so we went back. But let me tell you, that's why this coalition is so important. It's not the people in this country. It's the leadership. We went back to Forsyth. We organized for 4 days, 40,000 people. We had 25,000, we had 500 buses, 50 on the bus, 40,000. 90% of the people that came to Forsyth, the only contact we had with them was the media. And you know, and I'll tell you something else. It was the first march in the history of the civil rights movement had more whites than blacks. It was better than 51% white. Never before in a civil rights march did you have that many black professionals and business persons. Why, who could rent an airplane and fly to Atlanta, a bus overnight, a train, a ticket? These people, you know. And we formed a coalition, and everybody began to admit where we probably should have never left the streets and deserted Dr. King's works as we did. And we got the coalition, and I kept, you know, trying to keep that coalition together, because that's the most important thing. Not Hosea Williams, not Forsyth, but the coalition. Now, here's what happened. You know, it is economics. If you understand, here's Atlanta, Georgia, and there's two counties of Gwinnett and Cobb, the fastest growing county in America, and that's Forsyth. That land is a gold mine there. And the people that own all that land imported a lot of those Klansmen in there to beat us up, so blacks would never come back to that county. The majority of the people in Forsyth are not that bad. It's you know, now what has happened up there now? I'm debating the head Ku Klux Klansman in about 3 weeks. The guy Dean, who's running for president. But I had a white guy in that county came to me. And one of the things that will be calling upon you and seeking help. We have 110 acres of land to develop in Forsyth. And what we want to do is build some low and moderate housing on part of it, and build a training center for jobs exist, and recruit light industry that employs from 5 to 50 persons, and prove that poor whites and blacks and Spanish-speaking Americans and Indians that are working and able to make a living and take care of their families will take care of their business and let people alone simply because of their color, their religion. So that's the major project I have going in Forsyth now.
Well, thank you for bringing us up to date. That's very, very important. Jeannie Gibbons.
Reverend Williams, you're obviously a pretty charismatic leader. What are you telling young black people about the future? What are you inspiring them with? What are your words?
Well, number one, to learn your history, that you are somebody, and you have a heritage and a history to be proud of, and that as tough as it is, you can still make it if you try. And nobody is going to do for you what you can do for yourself, not even God. God help those who can help themselves. I tell them about an argument I had with Malcolm X one time, and Malcolm was right. When we were talking about going out integrated in white folks' neighborhood, Malcolm said, they'll never accept you because you have not accepted yourself. You know, it's not our fault because we're here in these slums. But let's take these slums and change these slums from a dungeon of shame to a haven of beauty, and people will be trying to move in your neighborhood. Nobody, and I'm saying, you know, I'm sick and tired of blacks telling me about my ancestors was in slavery, you know, but I've never been in slavery, you understand? And America, I can tell you this, I've been around the world twice, and with all the ills we have in this sick nation, it's the greatest nation on God's earth. I've been around the world twice. But what I'm trying to instill in young blacks now, you have to accept self. And when you accept self, you won't use drugs. When you accept yourself, understand your history, your past. You didn't come from no cave. You know, civilization started around the Nile. You know, the greatest university, you go back in history, about the University of Timbuktu, you have a heritage. Now, that's one of the things that you have to understand as an Indian person, that probably the greatest harm they did to us blacks as a people when they brought us to America as slaves was to take from us knowledge of our past. And he who knows not his history is destined to repeat it. But as old Mao Zedong said one time, to forget your past is betrayal. And I said, oh my God, what about my people that never knew their past? It's so important that our people understand that.
Mm-hmm.
I really want to get a chance to use your expertise. Our coalition was formed in April the 3rd. We're taping this show in October. We're so young. We have 120 organizations throughout the Northwest that already joined. We have over 200 delegates at this convention within a 4-month period after our birth as an organization. But with all the wonderful, wonderful experience you've had over the years, what would be some advice you would give the coalition?
I'm somewhat embarrassed because you all are in the leadership. See, even though we formed a coalition in Atlanta after Forsyth, the NWCAMH, the Urban League, the Jewish community, the Spanish-speaking community, but you all have become more, I would say, ethnic sensitive. You know, what I would say to the coalition, that you really should, there are two areas I'd like to advise you in. Number one, in the legislative area. And in order to do that, you've got to become a political force. Politicians are going to be politicians. But the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, we wrote legislation in the United States Congress. And that's and that's what I would like to urge you to do in this area here. And we started always, everything Martin Luther King Jr. started was in our area.
We have about 30 seconds.
And in magnitude. The other one is economics. We must develop an economic base that we not only control, but we own. We must open the mainstream up to ethnics as well so as the white power structure.
Reverend Williams, thank you so much. You've been one of the most stimulating people we've had on this program, and I join with Representative Givens in thanking you. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you will join us again next week, and we'll continue with some more guests on this important topic. Have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at the same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by an NIC student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.